All right, we're looking at boundaries and your family this evening. So this is boundaries and family issues. We're going to first go through what the authors Cloud and Townsend have labeled the most common family boundary struggles, and then we will look at their list of the best resolutions or solutions for those family struggles. So while boundary issues and conflicts can exist in any relationship, including a confrontation with a stock boy at the grocery store who ignores your request, or your neighbors who allow their cats to fight in your backyard, right underneath your bedroom window, in the middle of the night. Not that that's ever happened to me, but we have issues with people all around us in life. But as with most of the problems that we have in life, our most common boundary problems are with our family. And we should expect boundary issues with the people that we share the same homes with, the same refrigerator, the same finances, the same televisions, even the same DNA. Boundary issues are bound to come up. So we'll look, as I said, at the boundary issues, and then we'll look at potential resolutions. So let's look at how the boundary problems we have in our homes, even some things we might not necessarily see as problems. And all the titles of the sections are by the authors of the book. So first problem that we have is catching the virus. Catching the virus is when you allow problems in your extended family to negatively impact your immediate family. So many of our boundary issues are created when we take issues with our parents, our siblings, our cousins, and we allow our issues with them to harm our relationships with our spouse and with our kids. So we spend time with our parents, we spend time with our in-laws, and after spending that time with them, we are depressed monsters when we get back home over the time that we just had with them. And so this is about the principle, basically, that we can catch bad boundary behaviors from those who are outside of our immediate families, and we got to make sure that we don't take that virus from outside and bring it inside to our households and then make everybody else sick because of our feelings with our extended family. The second problem that we have is playing second fiddle. This is specifically related to a boundary problem between husbands and wives, and that is no husband or wife should be allowed to think for a second that they are the second most important person in their spouse's life. You should never allow your spouse to think that your parents or your children are more important than they are. So this is the basic principle that all of the boundaries in your life will be negatively impacted if you do not first have proper boundaries where you set up your spouse as the first and most important person in your life. So we all need to practice Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, which tells us that when we get married, that we are to leave our fathers and mothers, and we are to cleave to our wives or our husbands. And leave means to loosen or to forsake. And there should be such a gulf between your love for your spouse and your love for any other member of your family that in comparison, they would say that you have forsaken them because of how much more you love your spouse. Now, that does not mean we forsake our parents or we forsake our kids or our cousins or our siblings, but all of them should know that when it comes to our relationship with them, our spouse will never play second fiddle. My wife and I, Jen and I, we always make it abundantly clear to our kids that I am Jen's favorite person. Jen is my favorite person. So we make it sure to the kids, we're playing favorites, but none of you kids are the favorite. All of you are in second place in comparison to our relationship to one another, because if we have boundary issues with our spouse where we allow another person, even if it's our kids or our parents, to get in there into that role, that'll end up ruining all of our other relationships. Next is, may I have my allowance, please? In an increasing regularity, young adults enjoy an upper middle class lifestyle on an income that could never support an upper middle class lifestyle. And it's not always that they're diving headfirst into debt to sustain their lifestyle, but they are leaning on their parents' wealth. So their vacations for their kids are funded by their kids' grandparents. When money gets tight, they pick up the phone and call mom and dad for help. And this just means many young adults are not adults financially. And they do not set boundaries from their parents when it comes to money. And one of the big downsides of that is that, one, it stunts the maturity of the young adults. They don't grow to be responsible as they should be. And then also it allows the grandparents to have an unbiblical and an unhealthy sway over the lives of their adult children. You should not be able to hold your finances over your children's lives once they're adults. So we cannot fund our kids' lifestyles as young adults. We need to allow them to grow so that they can have a strong foundation built upon responsible behavior and not a faulty foundation that is built upon an allowance that's given to them by their parents. The next one goes right along with this one, which is, Mom, where are my socks? This is known as the perpetual child syndrome. This person may or may not be financially independent, but they are not adults when it comes to calling on their parents to perform basic functions in life. So the adult child is someone who also may or may not live at home, but this is the type of person who's going to depend upon mom to make their meals or dad to do their laundry. One of the typical characteristics of this type of person is that they don't get into a career type mindset with their work, but they're kind of jumping from high school type job to high school type job, and then they're taking the money that they're getting from work, and instead of spending it on necessities, they're spending it on expensive coffee, drinks, video games, clothes, and more childlike purchases. And this inevitably harms the relationship of every single person in the life of the perpetual child. So being a parent who's protecting those perpetual childs, it's not healthy. And it's not good for the child. A parent should not be planning for their kid's future, but once a kid's old enough to leave from home, a kid should be planning for their own future, and if anything, be focusing on how can I care for my parents when they get to an age where they're going to need help and support in their lives. Next is three's a crowd. Three is not company. Three is a crowd. Dysfunctional families are known for a boundary problem that is called triangulation. And triangulation ends up being just as bad as strangulation for those who are involved. In fact, I was just speaking to someone who had an issue with somebody at an old church that they were at, and basically they were dealing with this triangulation issue. This is a major symptom of people who have overall boundary issues in your life. And this is when person A has a problem with person B. But person A does not go to person B to talk about their problem with that person. Instead, person A goes to person C and says, "Can you believe what C did? I need to tell you what he did to me." And then a lot of times in these triangulation issues, after person A goes and complains about person B to person C, person B will go up to person C and say, "Did you hear what person A is doing? I asked them if I smelled bad, and they had the audacity to say I did smell bad. Can you believe they are such a jerk?" And when we get in these triangulation issues, lots of bad things that are happening. One, person C is put into either a terrible state personally or in an unbelievable, powerful state that no one should be in. They're on one hand put in a terrible state because they're judging between two different people. They have to be judging because two people are coming to them and basically saying, cast judgment upon the other person, but obviously they're not getting the full story. They are getting one-sided stories that are not the correct information, and they're being asked to cast judgment when they don't have the information to be able to. And if they're a manipulative person, they can use their role as the comforter for both parties to gain power and to gain standing over each of those individual persons. And Scripture is clear whenever it talks about a sin issue or a conflict issue between between two people, we are always to deal with those by going directly to the person we have wronged or directly to the person who has wronged us. If a third party comes into the picture because you can't get things right because you're still butting heads, when we bring that third person into the picture, it's not in a way of I'm running off to them to complain about that person. It's third party, can you come in to be in front of both of us so that we can deal with this whole situation together. And I was just surprised at just the number of scriptures they had listed that showed, going to another person is just, it's a bad way to deal with a problem. You go directly to the person, even as far as if you're bringing your altar to the temple and your sacrifice to the temple and you realize your brother sinned against you, you leave it there and you go and you deal with that problem directly. So do not bring in a third party to go and complain to about someone else, and it gets especially dangerous when you're both complaining to the same third party. Next is, who's the child here, anyhow? We got a clear Bible verse to start this one, 2 Corinthians 12:14. For children are not responsible to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. Now, this does not mean that children are off the hook and don't need to care for their parents, especially in their final weeks or months of life. If they have physical or mentally, they're no longer able to care for themselves. But what Paul is saying here is that children should not bail out their parents' irresponsible behaviors. So children need to take the time to determine when their parents' needs are real, when their parents' needs are legitimate to help, and then set up proper boundaries to say, this is when I can help you, and this is when I can't give. So a child should care for a parent if they're 85 years old and they fell and broke a hip. You need to do everything you can to be by your parent and care for them in that time period. But a parent who's 65 and has gambling issues and has financial difficulties because of that, you don't want to bail out that parent. I got a friend whose father passed away a little while ago, and his father had drug issues his whole life. And he never bailed out his dad with the issues that his dad had with drugs throughout his entire adulthood. But when it came to the final period of his dad's life right before he died, he was like a responsible child should and was there caring for his father the entire time during his dad's last days. And I think that's a good practice of balancing that, of knowing how to honor our parents even when they're broken, terrible people, but also not living in a way where we are enabling destructive behavior. So, and I think one of the keys for children who are put in a position where they need to care for their parents is that those children need to clearly state in advance what their boundaries are with their parents, so that their parents can know in advance that I can't go and ask my child to bail me out the next time I make a terrible business investment and invest in the next Six Flags theme park that's going in New Orleans East, because we know that's never going to happen. So we need to make sure that we let these people know in advance that we won't come through with them. The next issue is, but I'm your brother or I'm your sister. And we're going back to the mom, where's my sock individual. But this time it is how the irresponsible adult child harmfully impacts their siblings. An irresponsible sibling causes two primary problems with their brothers and sisters. The first thing that an irresponsible sibling does to their brothers and sisters is they cause illegitimate guilt and pressure to do what they should not. The brother is made to feel guilty for his sister's failings. The sister is pressured to pay for a bill that the brother cannot afford to pay, and the sister should not be responsible to pay. And feeling guilt because of what someone else has done wrong is never appropriate. If we do wrong, we should bear the burden of that wrong behavior and not put it upon the responsible person in our life to bail them out. I just saw a video on the news, and it was funny, so that's kind of why I'm going to bring it up. There was a woman who was, I think it was that she was a school board member of a school in New Jersey, driving through a school zone, and she was speeding through it, and she gets pulled over. And the guilt trip that she was trying to put on this police officer for pulling her over for speeding in a school zone. It's like, you're a school board member. If you're getting pulled over for speeding in a school zone, you should just be like, yeah, I did wrong. Let me pay the ticket. I know people can't speed in these areas. But she was trying to make it all to the police officer that you shouldn't have pulled me over. You were in the wrong. I was in the right. We can't guilt other people when we are the ones who are in the wrong. So the first issue with the brother-sister syndrome is that you give inappropriate guilt to someone who shouldn't have it. The other problem is that your siblings will end up resenting your parents because of your irresponsible behavior. So when parents constantly are needing to bail out the one child who's always in trouble, the other children will end up feeling slighted, they will end up feeling ignored, and it'll create a lot of resentment and tension between the parent and the other children. So I spoke 2 weeks ago about the law of responsibility. And one of the things that I mentioned in the law of responsibility is that the most loving thing that any person can do for those that are in their lives is to be responsible for themselves. Because the most unloving thing you can do to the people that are in your lives is require them to be responsible for you. And a lot of the issues that we see with the, but I'm your brother and sister, and mom, where are my socks? And the other similar title, which was, may I have an allowance, please, is that you are forcing other people to be responsible for your responsibilities, which really breaks families, ruins situations, and ruins relationships, and we want to clear out all that type of behavior in our lives. So the question is, we have all of these family issues that we're struggling with, so how do we sort out all of these problems? Where do we begin? And before we start to list out all the possible solutions, all the boundary issues that we're going to deal with, we want to again highlight the importance of another law we talked about last week, which is judging between harm and hurt. Because as we go through these solutions, if you're dealing with any of these family issues, one thing that you're immediately going to say when you look at all these solutions is, this is going to be painful. These are going to hurt. These are not going to feel good. Because forgiveness can hurt. It hurts to forgive other people who wrong you, depending upon how terrible the wrong was. Calling out problems of other people, it hurts. Saying no to someone who manipulates you to always say yes, and all of a sudden you're saying no to them. It hurts to say no. But we need to understand that hurt, it's okay. That hurt is a good hurt. Our key passage, I said, for boundaries is in Galatians chapter 6. We haven't spent a lot of time on Galatians 6:1, but Galatians 6:1 says, "Brethren, if anyone is caught in any trespass," and if you have boundary struggles, you are caught in trespasses, "you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself so that you too will not be tempted." And the word for restore, which I put in bold on the PowerPoint, that word for restore is actually a very specific medical term. That word for restore is the word that means to reset a broken bone. Have any of you guys had a broken bone reset in your life? Man, I was sure Barry would have.
Well, I had a broken nose, but it wasn't a bone. I guess it was way over here.
And did you have somebody put it back into place? And how did that feel when they put your nose back into place?
It didn't hurt at all.
Oh, terrible illustration, Barry. I'm not calling on you again. I'm assuming that if you have a broken bone and somebody resets it, it is going to hurt like the dickens. So, but it's going to hurt to get that bone reset. But the problem is, what happens if you get a broken bone and you don't get it reset? And that is, you will have problems with that part of your body for the rest of your life. So that hurting is not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, harm is something that must be avoided at all costs. When someone does break a bone, the last thing you want to do is walk up to them and accidentally drop another weight on top of that broken bone. That harm is bad. So we want to make sure that we come into this with our eyes open saying, this stuff's going to hurt. I know it's going to hurt, and that's okay. But I want to make sure that in the midst of the hurt, we do not cause unnecessary harm to other people. That all of these boundary actions that we take are with the goal to help people have greater responsibility, build them up, strengthen them, restore our relationship. Whereas we'll see in our last point here, this is all out of love and not out of, you're driving me crazy and I just want to get you out of my life. It's, I want you to have a better life. I want to improve your existence. So if we're going to fix these boundary issues, the first thing we need to do is identify the symptom. I thought this was kind of odd. This is not where I would have gone first, but these guys know what they're doing. And I think this is probably because it's the most fundamental way to start working on these boundary issues, and that is figure out what the surface level wrong is and just name it. Name it between you and the person that you're having an issue with. It is anxiety. It is with finances or money. It is with fear, guilt, shame. Start off by saying, here is the surface level problem. Here is where I'm hurting. Here is where my pain is. Here are where my fears are. And just get the symptoms out in the open, because this is how you say something's wrong. These initial symptoms are where we say, this is not right, and this is why things need to be fixed. And once we initially say there is something wrong, we've brought the symptoms out in the open. I have a fever, I got chills, I'm throwing up, there's obviously something sick about me. Then once we bring out the symptoms, then we identify the problem. So now we want to discover what laws of boundaries you or the other person are violating. Now, this is where it would be helpful to hold on to the notes of this class and hold on to those 2 pages that have those 10 laws of boundaries and say, here are where my boundaries are being violated. Here is how you are violating them. You could also keep holding on to where we're going to list all of these various boundary problems that you have in one notebook and be able to say, here, I hate to say it, but you are the, who's the child here anyhow? And you should be my parent, but you're acting like my child. This is not right. And so identify what the problem is so that you can deal with it. So first we want to pull out the symptoms to say there's something wrong, and then we want to label what the wrong actually is so we know what to fix. And then once we've identified the problem, then we need to identify the need. So this is the underlying issue that is driving the boundary conflict. The need is what is making someone act the way that they do. A lot of people are jerks, but most people who are jerks are not jerks for no reason at all. They have a reason, they have a need that they believe needs to be met. It might not be a need, it could be a want, but they have something that is driving them to act the way that they are. So we need to figure out what is the need that they're lacking in their life. It could be that they just feel like no one loves them, and that's why they're acting the way that they do, or they have a desperate need of approval of others, or to feel like they are accepted, or maybe it is they are drowning in debt because of the way that they've ruined their finances, and then that has snowballed everything else. So we need to figure out what that underlying need is, what it is that person is craving. So you need to get in deep with that person who is walking all over your boundaries and say, what is it that you need so that we can keep you in your yard? I can stay here in my yard. I will come through my fence to help you occasionally. You can come through my fence when I invite you in. But what is the need that is making you trample all over my life and my property? Let's figure out how to meet that need. So figure out what is, for them, the driving force that's creating the problem. And then once we've figured out that driving underlying issue, we need to take in and receive what is good. Take in and receive the good. And this might be the most difficult point. I feel like I've gotten with multiple people that I have counseled in my years as pastoring. I felt like we've identified symptoms, we identified problems, we figure out what the real need is, and then no change happens because they refuse to do this point. Taking in and receiving good means that you humbly reach out for help and receive support from others. So those who heal from their relationship issues are typically those who are willing to humble themselves and receive and respond to the love of others. Those who are proud, those who want to stand on their own 2 feet and say, I got it, I can take care of it, I don't need your help, I don't need your assistance, I got all this. Those are the type of people who they never move on from those problems, because if you get to the point where you have such boundary issues that someone is confronting you with those issues, you're almost always at a point where you need help from other people. You need to humble yourself and find that assistance. And the hard thing is that when we're dealing with somebody else in our life who needs to take in and receive the good, you can't force this. You can't make someone be humble. They need to humble themselves to be able to take in and receive that good. So this one is all about the humility to receive the goodness that will be offered. The next one for the cowardly lions, and I'm going to put myself in this bunch, that is practice boundary skills. So find friends who love you and support you. Find people that you do not currently have boundary issues with and ask them to help you with your boundary issues. Now, this is going to sound silly, but apparently just going through the motions of it helps you to be able to enforce your boundaries with others. So let's take Don. Don and I have a perfectly fine relationship, although I think I could make this example with anybody in this room. But Don and I have a great relationship with him, so I could come up to Don, though, and I could say, Don, you know what? I have a problem with saying no to this person in my life. They're making requests of me, and no matter how much I don't want to do it, I am always guilted into saying yes. So I need you over the next month to come up to me on some random times, maybe call me on the phone, and make some requests of me that are a little bit ridiculous. And I need to go through the motions of saying, no, Don, I can't do it. And then even try to guilt me into a little bit to say, like, don't you really need to come over and help me, and if you don't do it, I just don't know. And then I need to stand firm and say, no, I can't help you with that. I don't have time. I have already told you in the past, I'm not going to assist you with this. And they say, and I'm going to trust these guys because they've done this enough, just simply having someone where you can audibly say no to them, or I'm not going to go through with that, will help you to say no to that other person in your life where you find like you can never say no to them. So, and I'm just using that as a conflict in a situation of when you can't say no, but if you have somebody in a certain situation where you always end up saying what you regret to that person, find someone that you trust, someone who you know you can be rude to their face, and you'll still be friends in with the end because they know the goal that you're reaching toward, and ask them to kind of play out those situations with you a couple of times over a month so that you can just get used to audibly saying, I can't do what you're asking me to do, and I can't follow through on that. So just get used to saying, we need to stay within our budget. Karen, don't ask me to spend any more money for the church because we need to stay within budget, and then help yourself to get to be able to say those type of words when you get home. So practice your boundary skills. Next is say no to what is bad. Say no to the bad. Boundaries are to have fences, we mentioned in the first week, to let in the good, and those fences should also be able to be closed and locked to shut out the bad. So we need to be able to say no when people are trying to take advantage of us, say no when people are pulling us into situations that will harm us or our family. So this one, I think, is really short because it just sort of goes right along with the two that are before. So say no to what is bad. Next is maybe the next two are both probably the most difficult. Forgive the aggressor. Nothing clarifies boundaries more than forgiveness. To forgive others means to love them in spite of what they are doing or have done to you. Refusing to forgive a family member is one of the primary driving issues that causes people to be stuck for years in the same dysfunctional issues. When you don't forgive someone, it is a sign that you still want something from them, Because when you forgive someone, what you're really saying is, I don't need you to give me that approval. I don't need you to give me whatever you owe me. I don't need you to give me making that sure that I feel superior to you. You're saying, I'm willing to forgive you because I'm going to get all the grace and support I need from my Heavenly Father. I'm going to get everything that I need fully from Jesus Christ, so I'm willing to forgive you the wrongs that you have done to me. So it's better to forgive someone else and then seek what you would want from them from God and trust in God to give you grace that's far beyond what the other person would offer. So a willingness to forgive someone is a huge step in your ability to fix old boundary issues. And then next is respond, don't react. When you react to something that someone says or does, you have a problem with boundaries. Reacting is when you respond to someone else's anger with more anger of your own. Reacting is when someone lies about you, so you're going to go and lie about them. Reacting is when someone brings up your old sin from 2014, so you're going to bring up their old sin from 2018. And then you're going to say, ha, your sin was more recent than my sin, so I'm better than you are. So reacting is when you respond in kind. Responding is when you remain in control of your choices and actions and options. And if you feel like all I'm going to do is react here, that person yelled at me and I'm just going to yell back. They throw a fit, I'm going to throw a fit. I'm about to start acting like Elias because he's driving me crazy. At that point, when you feel like you're going to react, typically the best thing to do is to step away. Remove yourself from the argument, maybe go for a drive. Possibly the best thing to do is find someone else that you can speak to and vent to them about your issue with that person. There's been multiple people that I have relationships with, specifically people that I know that aren't in the church that I don't have overly close ties to, and I make sure I let them know, if you've got a point where you feel like you're going to lash out and scream at somebody, you call me and you lash out about them to me, and I'll just listen. I don't know anything about the problem, but I'll just give you an opportunity to vent. And then once you get that out, then go back to that person, respond reasonably, speak clearly, stand up for the boundaries that you and your family need to have at that point, but don't react to someone else's sinful behavior with more sinful behavior of your own. That is almost always going to harm the other person. But we need to react in such a way that we are kind when they are hurtful, we are gracious when they are unforgiving, and we are loving and trying to restore relationships and not win points against people who have wronged us. And now our final fixing the boundary issues is learn to love in freedom and responsibility, not in guilt. Good boundaries, the best boundaries, are boundaries that are built out of love. And loving boundaries are boundaries that we build in order to prefer others when we would naturally be preferring ourselves. So this means that we cannot create boundaries that are doing one of two things. We can't create boundaries that are for the purpose of hiding our own sin problems. We can't create boundaries that are just done so that no one knows about all the ways that I mess up, all the things that I do wrong. Boundaries are not for the purpose of hiding sins, of hiding iniquities. One issue that far too many church leaders and church pastors have had over church history is that in order to keep their ministry after they do wrong things, is they start building up all of these walls and boundaries around their personal life so that no one can see the harmful behavior that they have against other people. Boundaries, though, should never be done to hide our sin. And also, boundaries should not be put up primarily. Now, this is not to say they can't be used this way, but the primary purpose of boundaries is not to protect ourselves from any potential harm by others. Because if we're honest, if you're going to love other people, if you're going to really care for them and be gracious to them and be merciful to them and be compassionate to them. If you want to really love someone, the one thing that you're going to do is you are going to open yourself up to be hurt by them. If you just think about God and his relationship to Israel, God opened himself up to Israel in ways that are deeper than we probably ever appreciate in the church. And you read about the parables of love that are told between Israel and the church in the Old Testament. And the stories in Ezekiel are like, wow, well, that's way too much information, Ezekiel. And we read about Hosea and the love that he had for his wife as being an illustration of God's love for Israel. And by God entering into that covenant love relationship with Israel, what God allowed himself to be open for is for Israel to do wrong against him, to sin against him, to defame his name, to ignore his commandments, to go right into his temple with false gods and bow down before them in his temple. God opened himself up to have harmful, painful things come from his own people because he loved them. And if we're going to love other people, it means that there is a possibility that we're going to be hurt. But a lot of times people set up boundaries that are so tall, that are so strong, that are so thick, that we keep everybody else away so that I'm never hurt. We talked about how this is one of the most common boundary issues with people who have experienced abuse as a child. They never want to experience that pain again. So as an adult, they create boundaries where they can't ever have real loving relationships with people because they want to make sure that those people don't hurt them as they were hurt before. But boundaries are not given to protect us from all painful harm, but boundaries are given really to provide freedom. Boundaries are given so that I can live with freedom, so that I can walk in my life and live how God desires me to live. And also, proper boundaries around my life should help the people in my life live in freedom as well. Because then I'm not trampling all over their lives and I'm not walking all over them. And also, if I have good boundaries with good fences, that means I can go into their life and assist them to help them to live in greater freedom. And so if your boundaries aren't giving greater freedom in your life, they're not the right kind of boundaries. Because if you think about it, the one sin that, I shouldn't say the one sin because whenever you try to hierarchy them, you always look like an idiot when you go to some other passage. But one of the sins in the New Testament that is just like clearly gets at Paul is the sin of legalism, where we're setting up these legalistic barriers between us and sin so that, there's no possible way I could ever do this, so I'm going to set up all these layers to make sure that I'll never get drunk, so I'll never even look at an alcoholic beverage. Well, that's not right. We shouldn't set up barriers and boundaries like that. We shouldn't be legalists. God desires us to live in freedom, to enjoy this world, but not to live in the sinful practices of this world. And so if our boundaries are turning into legalistic, barbed wire barriers that are separating us from loving other people, then those boundaries need to go down. The purpose is for us to live in freedom to serve God without fear, without guilt that's given to us by others, and then freedom also to help others live responsibly in their own lives as God would desire them to live. So when we set up boundaries, we need to be thinking, is this boundary that I'm setting up with this other person, telling them they can't get any more money from me, or they can't, push me around in this way, or I'm not always going to say yes every time they ask. Am I setting up this boundary because it is helping me love God first and then love them second? If that isn't a result of that boundary, then that's not a good boundary. The result of every boundary should be, as a result of this, I can better love God because I'm not enabling sinful practices. Obviously, enabling a sinful practice is not a way that we love God. Enabling a sinful practice is not a way that we love other people. So we need to make sure that we are not enabling sin in the way that we are living. So our boundaries are to love others. And we need to remember that when it comes to loving boundaries, that the first boundary that was ever built was the boundary that was built by God himself. And it was the boundary given to Adam and Eve where he said, don't eat of this tree. And it was loving for God to say, don't eat of this tree. Could you imagine how the Genesis story would look different if God did not tell them to eat of that tree? And they were just walking through there and all of a sudden they picked the fruit and boom. You know, God would not be a loving God, we would say, because he didn't warn them. He didn't set up that boundaries. So boundaries are loving. And one of the most loving things that you can do about your boundaries is to be like God and let the other people in your life know about those boundaries. To say, this is the boundary I'm going to establish between me and you. This is how we're going to enforce it. This is how we're going to live it out. It might hurt, but this will be better for the long term. And then when we enforce those boundaries, when push comes to shove, again, that is a loving thing to do. And it should always be about love first.